Hello and welcome to Breaking Culture Live. Uh, my name is Sean Andrews, and I'm your host. I'm the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association. I'm broadcasting from Chicago, where it is actually spring now. Finally, I think we are going to have a whole week of spring. So I'm really pleased today to welcome Rhea Lynn Barnes to speak about her truly monumental book, and it's monumental in size as well as I can't. Yeah. Darkology, Blackface, and the American Way of Entertainment. The book is the result of over a decade of archival research, collecting and analyzing an unprecedented quantity of blackface ephemera from the past century and a half. It's truly a breathtaking work in scope and revelation, and I'm really looking forward to talking with her about it. Rhea Lynn Barnes is assistant professor of American Cultural History at Princeton University and the Sheila Biddle Ford Foundation Fellow at the Hutchinson Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Thanks so much for joining us today, Rhea Lynn.
Thank you. I'm honored.
So I've read and even written a bit about the origins of minstrelsy in the U.S. And for years, I've shown that Marlon Riggs' documentary Ethnic Notions in my class. And even when I thought I knew about the extent to which these artifacts were produced and circulated in our culture, seeing them all amassed in one place is always shocking. And it's like I know they're there, but as soon as I step away, this sort of amnesia sits in. But your book shows there's really no way to step away. The minstrelsy is fundamental to American culture. It's everywhere. Uh, was there a moment you realized this or that sets you on the path to the revelations you make in this book?
Yes. I actually cannot remember a time when I was not interested in blackface minstrelsy. But I will say I did sort of have a moment of racial consciousness in the way that we talk about in the African American literary tradition in classes. In 1992, I was a child in Southern California. And during the Los Angeles uprisings, it spilled
Mm.
into Long Beach and Orange County. And I grew up in Anaheim, California, blocks from Disneyland. And Disneyland, I don't know if it was the Anaheim Union High School District. I don't know who made this choice, but they felt that the safe thing or idea for children was to bring us to Disneyland, the happiest place on earth. And I was in a classroom that was incredibly diverse, white minority. And I just had this really visceral moment during the uprisings of being with my best friend who was Black on Main Street at Disneyland. And they play in a carousel all of the different classic Mickey Mouse cartoons. And one of them is called Mickey's Melodrama, where he wants to put on a stage production of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but in blackface set to Dixie. And he cannot figure out how to black himself up. And so he sticks a stick of dynamite in his mouth, lights the fuse, and blows himself up into blackness. And I just remember all of us standing there while like actual rioting is going on outside. And I thought, is no one else seeing this? Like, even as a child, I thought this is completely insane. And so I think from that moment forward, I just started noticing that race was fake and seemed to run everything in America. And I was completely obsessed with trying to understand what blackface was. The number one song at the time was Michael Jackson's Black or White. And so I really thought like, what, what is going on here? And so that was the main impetus. And then fast forward to when I was in college, I was in a freshman class about American slavery. And all of the literature that we read, the historiography, was looking at blackface minstrelsy in the 1830s to the 1860s, and basically argued that it declined during the American Civil War and by 1900 was subsumed into things like vaudeville and radio, and that theatrical blackface as a main stage event died out. And I thought, what are you talking about? I see it everywhere.
Hmm.
And so that was sort of the intellectual motivation as a researcher and scholar to try and document what I actually found was an escalation and acceleration of a genre that we had incorrectly believed was dying out.
Yeah, I mean, I love the stuff about you bring up or find all of this the really detailed information about the Works Project Progress Administration, like the New Deal administration, the U.S. military, um, promoting it as a sort of, this is the thing we should promote as American culture.
Mhm.
There's several moments where you kind of you're kind of poking it, or you're kind of talking about how they see this as the sort of pivotal part of American culture, and there's an implicit critique there, but it really is. It's all there. That's all that we're doing this whole time, and promoting in a really kind of obsessive way,
Mhm.
across the globe, throughout the country. You need to have these minstrel songs promoted. So,
Yeah, absolutely. In the 19th century, which is where the bulk of the historiography was focused, there was really only about 60,000 shows. And in the 20th century, when you look at amateur form, which is really what the book is looking at, it switches to 1 million shows a year. And so there's really only an explosion or a democratization, depending on how you want to think of it, of the genre.
mhm,
And it's exactly because of the institutions that you just referenced that the WPA and the United States military federalizes blackface during the Great Depression and World War II. And by doing that, it takes music like Stephen Foster music and classic blackface songs and puts it into the public domain and also enters it into school curriculum. And once you have it in the militaries, the schools, and the Works Progress Administration, it just becomes a daily function of American life. And there's
yeah.
this argument, as you referenced, that this was the height of American culture that needed to be protected and enacted and defended in a moment where either from the Depression or World War II, there was a concern that we were losing our authentic American culture.
Yeah, and so as you open the book, you note it was everywhere, and in part because it's everywhere, it's nowhere. Right?
Mhm.
That libraries and archives don't really keep track of it. They don't label it correctly. Some of it's labeled as Black culture, which seems really perverse,
Yeah.
but, um, so I'm gonna just take a step back and talk about your process. What's been your method for tracking down this evidence? And most of it, is it now housed in archives, or do you have a really big garage? I mean, there's tons of this stuff, I imagine, that you have.
I think my method has been insanity. Uh, I don't know how else to answer.
Classic scholarly method, for sure.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I talk about in the introduction that part of the problem is that Jim Crow America, which is literally named after the most famous blackface minstrel character, was a white supremacist culture in which there was no need to essentially collect and preserve this because it was just the air that was being breathed at the moment. And also these were Jim Crow libraries. So that's part of the problem. The other major problem was this legacy of censorship in the material evidence is a unintended consequence of a successful wing of the civil rights movement that I talk about, which is that Black mothers and also the NAACP had such a successful coordinated effort to get this material out of our public institutions that then the pendulum swung so widely that even the act of collecting this as primary sources or doing research was seen as taboo. And so part of what I had to do and why this book took so long to create was that I had to literally recreate an archive that did not exist. Most collections related to blackface are either dedicated to the antebellum story or focus on film and television. But in terms of the amateur plays, how-to guidebooks, and programs, there really wasn't anywhere to turn to. And so that meant having to do all kinds of bizarre things to reconstitute the historical record. I would say the sort of watershed moment where I realized that this was something to take seriously actually was as early as 2008 when Barack Obama's ascendancy began. There was a lot of libraries and friends of libraries that were mass purging this because they did not want to have essentially taboo or potentially racially offensive material. And so I could get them for free because they were just throwing them away. And I would use the back covers, which in sort of a Pokemon Collect Them All or a comic book way, would list for the readers at the time other titles that they could collect or order. And there was also catalogs for teachers to send away for. And I basically used those as collecting guides so that I could track down every single title that was released every year. And so I would go through a lot of estate sales. Normally these were just given to me because the family just wanted somebody to take them away.
Right, you're talking about somebody who has this, like, box up in their attic that no one's touched, they're just kind of
Yeah.
afraid that someone will find it someday.
Exactly. The other sort of crucial thing during 2008 was the housing crisis, because
Mm,
so many Americans needed to downsize or were forced out of their house in pretty violent means and could not take their belongings. And so it got to the point where I could walk up and down streets in Northern California, where I lived at the time, and just find this strewn out on suburban lawns. And so I would just sort of walk through places like Walnut Creek in Oakland and pluck them up. Then I would say I got quite scholarly about it and was trying to figure out how to reconstitute a bibliographic database going to libraries. But as I lay out in the introduction, because a lot of times theatrical material is organized by date
mm.
or genre, and this was not recognized amateur blackface as a distinct genre, you could essentially waste weeks trying to find something that was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And so I really had to get smart about figuring out how to search publishing lines and sublines in a way that most catalogs didn't operate. And so sometimes that meant having to like write my own code to get the catalog to do what I needed it to do.
Wow. And as you're going around picking this stuff up off the side of the road, you I mean, you again, you're putting this in your house? What is the
Well, I don't own
vessel?
a house. I'm a millennial. So.
Sure, sure. But in what vessel were you collecting all of this stuff? Because it just seems like, the way that you should sort of, like, pull in a whole range of archival materials, and it's sort of clear that you have a bunch of it.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine the, how that's amassed in a very material way in your
Yeah.
environs.
So much of my life in my 20s was just driving this horrendous, disturbing material, which I basically say is evidence of a mass cultural hate crime around the country, wherever I found it. So sometimes I would be on Amtrak with an extra suitcase that wouldn't be full of clothing. It would be full of these documents wherever I found them. You could ship them media mail. So I was constantly shipping them to a friend who was close by or to my parents. And then what I would do is I would set up my apartments with filing cabinets and I would try to recreate them in the order in which they came out for each publishing house, their subline, and then the years they were released, because then I could physically see the stereotypes as they changed over time. But as I told you before we were getting on the call, it got to the point where it was so sort of psychologically torturous for me to live with these things where I was both writing about them and then sleeping next to them, that I ultimately had to remove them. So I basically paged for archival storage units that they are environmentally protected and climate control. But at the same time, I got to the point after a few years, I could not spend every
Yeah,
waking moment with them. It was truly driving me crazy. So I needed physical distance.
I can only imagine. Yeah, it I can only imagine needing to have that space. It kinda reminds me of the last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where they're just closing it up and everybody walking away. Um,
I
but
will say
but what
it became a very bizarre litmus test, though, for anyone who came to my house. If I met someone, they were like, "What's in those?" And I'm like, "Oh, let me tell you what I'm working on."
Sure,
You
sure.
figure out people's politics real quick.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, and what's striking about this is that it's or about what you're talking about is that it isn't just these material objects. What they are all most of what you're looking at are like instruction manuals, right? And scripts that definitely circulate, but what is interesting is or what's sort of disturbing is that it's about creating this, what board you might call a habitus. It's about training non-black people to inhabit blackness in a certain way, which then leads them to live their white supremacist fantasy by never having to define whiteness per se. And as I read your book, I felt this sort of a really deep disgust as a white person, um, by how these instructions were spread by the New Deal administration, the U.S. military, schools, universities, churches, politicians, and especially civic organizations like the Elks and Rotary clubs. But yeah, but it's really about teaching white people how to act black, which is
Yeah.
it's perverse. Um,
Yeah.
so
A lot of people think that I made up the title Darkology. It's
yeah,
actually a phrase that I learned from Bing Crosby, of all people, who in the 20th century was a huge purveyor and publisher of Blackface how-to minstrel guidebooks and sheet music. And it basically was a 19th century insider term used by Blackface performers to mean the art, for lack of a better word, that's what they used, of learning how to physically and racially stereotype and inhabit blackness and
mhm,
caricature. So how do you walk funny like a black person? How do you talk funny like a black person? And these guidebooks, which were published originally by the famous global celebrities of antebellum blackface, really break down and mass commercialize step by step how to recreate these stereotypes that are not based in reality at all, right? They're
right,
perversions and cultural creations. But what's disturbing is once they're in these how-to step-by-step guides that are then codified in everyday American civic and social institutions, it gets to the point where a few generations out, people believe that this is authentic and an accurate representation of Black life, especially in places like sundown towns where there are not Black populations. And these are being introduced to school children by their politicians, their principal. And so I have so many interesting conversations now with people who grew up in Jim Crow America, whether they are white, Japanese American, Indian American, on reservation schools, boarding schools, who basically say, like, I thought that this was real until I grew up and then, actually met people. And so that's part of their disturbing power, is that they not only tried to sell authenticity, but also sort of uh, for lack of a better word, a sort of imprint of
hmm
authenticity that you were learning.
yeah. And Bing Crosby and Isaiah Berlin, not Isaiah, it's Irving Berlin.
Yeah.
Who also shows up in the book, helping the army create a minstrel show. Uh, but my one of my sort of most uh pivotal moments was when, I don't remember how we happened upon it, but watching Holiday Inn,
Yes.
which I'm just like, oh, well, this is the guy who sang White Christmas. I mean, it's just about holidays, right? And then you get into February, and you're like, holy shit, were they all dressed up in blackface, and this is like in color, American film, and they're doing this in a really earnest and sincere way, and it's kind of absurd, but this is, reading your book, that was much more normal than not, at this moment.
And I think for people who do cultural studies, that is an interesting example where even though those films were created in the 1940s with the creation of, cable and TCM, you have new generations who in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s could watch those multiple days a week and being presented as, once again, emblematic of American culture or cherished cinema that we should all be fluent in. And so
Mhm.
that's certainly one of the ways that I was introduced to Holiday Inn. And then White Christmas has a white minstrel show in it. And so that recirculation that we're not even cognizant of is something that I am really fascinated by.
I as I was reading, I was wondering, do you get a sense of what the people who donned these costumes felt or were supposed to feel about race and especially blackness? And so I know that early in the book you talk about Eric Lott's book Love and Theft,
Mhm,
who kind of writes that some of what was going on was that white people actually felt somehow liberated
mhm.
when they performed blackface, so that there was a certain love there. But it feels like in looking at the way that not only people deployed it in the United States, but then the way that they resisted it's being kind of scaled back. Um, you don't talk much about this in the book, but I'm sure there's a range. But do you have a sense of what people felt they were doing when they put on these costumes? White people felt they were doing when they put these costumes on.
Absolutely. So, full disclosure, Eric's one of my BFFs, and I really see my book picking up where his book left off at the Civil War. So I think that his analysis for antebellum America, which is largely, and David Roediger as well, which is tightly focused on the emerging white working class in antebellum America, primarily in the Five Points and the Bowery in New York City, that holds. But one thing that my book argues is the context later, especially in the 20th century, becomes more complicated. And I'm going to answer this in two ways. And
Sure.
first, one of my arguments is that in the 20th century, it's not about the creation of whiteness anymore, because once it is a requirement to people like Japanese Americans in concentration camps, who are in concentration camps
Hmm.
particularly because they are not white, obviously something different is going on there, why I think it's much more tied to issues of Americanness and Americanization. But in terms of what people thought, it's incredibly varied based on context. But the most dominant argument was that people felt they were doing something that was reflective of accurate Black culture. They thought they were doing a patriotic duty, primarily because of the context in which it had been encouraged to them, whether it was from municipal or federally funded shows. You can also just see that in the ways in which a lot of the shows have huge American flags, or maybe
Hmm.
a showboat that has, the bunting. And a lot of the endmen costumes are normally red and white striped pantaloons. And so there's a lot of gestures towards American identity and American patriotism. But I think the most complex thing for me to understand, that took me a very long time to understand, is they would double down and say, but I wasn't racist. And I was like, what on earth are you talking about? Like, there's nothing more horrific in terms of what you could do as a cultural expression. And what I learned is that because of the ways that the books presented this, they often thought that they were replicating and honoring accurate Black culture, while not understanding that what they were doing was white supremacist culture. Um, I think this is kind of akin to what Megyn Kelly was arguing when she had her blackface kerfuffle, which is that she was trying to argue that if someone is dressing up as Diana Ross for Halloween, it's because they love Diana Ross. Well, you don't need to do blackface to honor
Diana
Diana
Ross.
Ross. Um, and so this was something that civil rights workers were sort of adamantly arguing, which is, if you want to celebrate Black culture, great. This is not Black culture. This is white supremacist culture. And one thing that I think ties into the book Satchmo Blowing Up the World is, essentially it gets to the point where civil rights workers convince the federal government that blackface, in fact, is not the most successful American cultural export. If you want that answer, you should look to jazz music. And so
Mm.
there's finally a shift in the 1950s of the federal government, instead of using blackface on all of the army bases and as a form of cultural diplomacy, to finally switching over to jazz, which then sort of reanimates this huge international jazz network. And so that's also an interesting footnote in terms of how it is moving through the world and how average Americans think of it when they physically do it.
Yeah, the it that's interesting. And I guess the flip side of that is I was also wondering, Because you don't say much about it, but I'm sure that they existed. People like Burt Williams, kind of black performers who were forced to don blackface. Um, was he a total outlier, or is that something that
No.
was common? And how did they kind of respond or react to these restrictions?
Yeah, so in the part of the book that's dedicated to FDR, I really explore the role of blackface. And I do that through a few main characters or historical subjects. But overall, something that's really important to understand is after emancipation, people who wanted to be professional performers, if they wanted to perform on stage or if they wanted to, write or compose, were pretty much relegated to blackface or minstrel shows being their only opportunity to do that. And due to a lot of pretty disturbing Reconstruction era and Jim Crow era laws, to get around things like vagrancy laws or transportation laws that were restricting Black movement. One loophole was if you were touring with a minstrel show, you could travel and tour the country. And so it forces a lot of people to engage in blackface who did not want to. But what I talk about in the book is the fact that most of these people, like James Weldon Johnson or Bob Cole or Burt Williams, for example, are typically engaging in satire, that they are creating work that they feel in subject matter humanized Black life, but also commented on what it was like to be a Black man in Jim Crow America. The problem is that Black audiences understood that complexity and white America did not. They continued to just read the performances as if they
Right.
were accurate representations. And so in a really sort of dire way, I talk about how a lot of these men describe essentially going crazy from having to wear the minstrel mask and recognizing the word they use a lot is grotesqueness, that I could only be accepted on stage if I was grotesque. Um, and so there's a lot of unfortunate suicides that happen from these truly famous Black performers at the turn of the 20th century who feel like the only way that they can be beloved is to belittle themselves this way. But at the same time, it because of the substantial amount of money that is raised through these Black performers, they are a lot of times taking that money and funneling it to places like the NAACP, which ultimately, their first national campaign is against Birth of a Nation. And
Right.
so it's this really sort of complex conversation that's happening with blackface performing.
You mentioned that moment. You go through a few really historical moments in the book. I mean, and some of it's the framing, and then you go back and forth. Um, and it seems like one of the most important is that late 1800s when all these publishing houses sort of ramp up nationwide and even worldwide, distributing the music, the play scripts, and turning it into a major culture industry. So I'm wondering if there's a specific turning point for you I guess you're saying you're picking it up after the Civil War, but is there another particular turning point that sort of stands out for you in the
Yeah,
way that black that this darkology uh, develops?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. So I think 1868 is critical. In that moment after the American Civil War, the 400 top minstrel celebrities get together and they found first an organization called the Jolly Corks, which is a joke and a play on words related to both blacking up, using burnt cork, and also their penchant for drinking. They then morph into the Benevolent Protective Order of the Elks or the Elks Club, which becomes America's largest fraternal order with 1.5 million members. And that's really critical because then it creates this direct line between blackface minstrelsy, political power, and these publishing houses. And between 1868 through basically the birth of Jim Crow, 1896 to 1900, you have this explosion of the amateur genre and these how-to print guidebooks, and that only continues to develop. I think obviously the birth of Jim Crow as a legal system is critical. A really sort of disturbing footnote is the same day we get Plessy v. Ferguson is also the same day we have projected film in America. And so
Hmm.
literally from the moment that we have the birth of film, we have this legal regime based in minstrelsy. But then I think skipping ahead, it's really the creation of the WPA that is
Hmm.
the critical moment that globalizes this material. And then it ratchets up one more time with World War II. And then the civil rights movement in the 1950s is the beginning of the dismantling of this commercialized amateur industry. And I use the word amateur because that is the language that was used by the guidebooks. But I in no way want to suggest that this was not sophisticated.
Sure.
And it was also a multi-million-dollar industry. In fact, far outpaced professional minstrelsy in terms of commerce. And that one thing that's really critical for me to convey to students is at first blush, it sounds like the one saving grace in amateur form is that these are primarily for charity shows. But in the context of Jim Crow America, if you are raising money for a school or a hospital using blackface, you're raising money for a segregated school or a segregated hospital. And so
Sure.
not only are these caricatures really dehumanizing and justifying things like lynching, like mass disenfranchisement, but it is also setting up the economic basis that really underpins the Jim Crow political economy.
Yeah, you the chapter you have in there on blackface capitalism um, is a real tour de force for me. I know what programs like those look like, the playbills with these random advertisements from local businesses, and I think you make a really compelling argument for the way that they fit into the political economy of these local towns. You say it
Mhm.
creates what you call a kind of inverted green book,
Mhm.
steering white residents toward white owned or white only businesses, and in effect, sort of a guide to maintaining white supremacy. Um,
Mhm.
uh, I am curious when you started happening upon these programs, like if that was early in the development, and then kind of how you gathered them, because it seems like they're the
Yeah,
kind of thing that would just get thrown away most of the time.
exactly. So when you look at most of the books that are written about blackface, the majority of the primary sources are playbills that are like massive 3 feet playbills that would be hung outside of theaters in the 19th century. And they pretty much just say who the players are, and there's the main title in bold. But in the 20th century, these playbooks sometimes can be 20 to 100 pages of really detailed step by step, not only who all is engaging in the show, but as you said, all of these local corporations. Sorry, let me grab water real quick. I'm in London. I'm in London. There's like a huge heat wave going on.
Oh, um,
Sorry, thank you.
it's good for them. We talked to some people in London, like, earlier in the year, and they said it had been raining all year long, so it's good that they're finally having some sun.
Yeah. Um, but when you look at these playbills, most universities and libraries were not collecting them. And so it's exactly what you're saying, that they were seen as ephemera, they were normally thrown away because when you first look at them, it's almost like a grandmother kept this because their child was in a first grade play,
Exactly, yeah, yeah.
so who cares? But what I started noticing is that people would cut out, there would be basically like missing holes that people had cut out from them. They had been torn up or they had check marks all over them. And so I was trying to figure out what is going on here. And so it quickly became clear to me that it was actually wives and mothers who would take the programs home and they would document which people they knew in the cast, what their relationship was in the sort of social networking of their small town or schools or churches. But then also, as you said, document the specific corporations and companies that they wanted to essentially support, and that was always tied to the racial economy. And so I started recognizing, like, wow, these are not just bizarre family keepsakes. These are in
Right.
fact documents of how Jim Crow shadow governments and economies worked, essentially.
Yeah, and becomes a way of. I mean, and I was kind of curious I know that these are circulating in a very particular milieu, but I don't like. I was wondering, like, there must be some group in the community that doesn't find these. I mean, that finds them reprehensible on some level, right? I mean,
Exactly.
you know, and I guess like I want to kind of come back to the Elks especially, and you know, but I feel like when you finally got to the 1950s and discussing the resistance, especially like within the military first, but then kind of going into the NAACP, it was kind of like I was like, oh, good, finally. It's sort of. It's I was like, I mean, I knew that there had to be some people that were like, this is terrible. We don't want this,
Course.
you know. And so it was nice to have that, but I was wondering as like, are there is there any evidence of these programs being the opposite of someone going like, well, I don't want to support these businesses or these are the businesses we should boycott? Or is that only after the 1950s maybe?
Um, Well, I should say, so there's always been opposition, right? Going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, that people
Sure.
were very vocal about how disgusting this genre was. But I think the difference of why there's a shift in World War II is because of the Great Migration, because of the mass mobilization during World War II. All of a sudden, you have everyday Black Americans who are inhabiting spaces where they're being expected to perform it themselves in amateur form. And so that is really their major moment where they're saying, the Jim Crow army is legitimate beyond just the metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Uh, in terms of evidence of people collecting the programs, yes. So the not just the NAACP, but a lot of times allies like Jewish mothers, for example, would be given the programs and they would find it so disgusting that they would then take that to the NAACP and try to point out the specific corporations that were profiting from these shows or specific politicians. And they realized that protesting amateur blackface in print culture was quite different from protesting blackface in Hollywood, because if you're just mad about Birth of a Nation or Gone with the Wind, you are protesting a corporation that's often Hollywood or New York. When
Right.
you're looking at amateur form, you're going against your school principal, your sheriff, your mayor. And so the incredible risk is very real to Black Americans in terms of what could happen to them for protesting blackface. And so the evidence and document collecting becomes very important for the NAACP to try and build court cases to show how widespread this is. The other group that's interesting is people like Paul Robeson and his wife try to collect this and try to take it to the UN and say, this is a domestic violation of the newly emergent global human rights law. And so, much like abolitionists in the 19th century who tried to collect things like fugitive slave runaway ads as evidence of
Sure.
a counter archive of violence, the programs do operate in that way as well.
Yeah, the that as I was reading that section, it's something I've thought about quite a bit recently, because I feel like what we're missing right now is the counterbalance. We don't have the Soviet Union to sort of give us that sort of like we need to be and concerned about human rights. As we're seeing a kind of resurgence of a serious white supremacist. I mean, it's always been there, but now it's like explicitly white supremacist culture, and I feel like that underpinning is missing, and it would be nice to have that as a backstop. Um, but uh, uh,
Absolutely.
um, the Elks, I
Mhm.
had never given much thought to the Elks before reading this, but they are. I mean, we're kind of going back in time for a minute, but since you said this was a turning point, they're kind of they're a product of the success of the minstrelsy, right? They're all
Correct.
minstrel performers as much as an engine of it, right? And it's like a union and a lodge where you can stay. It's a very weird organization. Um,
Yeah, it
yeah.
was originally founded immediately in the context of the Civil War, where a lot of veterans and actors realized that they basically had no form of mutual aid societies, and that if they needed assistance for medical bills, or if there was a widow that they wanted to take care of, there was no way to essentially pool resources to protect each other. And then increasingly, they recognized with the advent of uh, railroads and the ability to do global tours through ships, that they were constantly sort of vagrant, homeless, roaming
Hmm.
people. And so with the creation of the Elks Club, not only did they create an economic uh mutual aid society, but they can create these lodges that are home away from home, that are private spaces where they can control who enters. They can remain white supremacist exclusive organizations. They can have alcohol, they can have prostitution, and really recreate the culture of the Five Points and the Bowery concert saloons all the way up through basically the 1970s. It's not till the late 1970s that they're forced to integrate. And so they really externally present as a group of upstanding American citizens who do an enormous amount of fundraising for charity, especially for servicemen and women and veterans. But the bulk of their financing, especially the fact that they are one of the largest property owners in the country, that expansion is coming through the revenue of Blackface minstrel shows. And also, they do a lot of political networking. So it's
Yeah.
hard to find politicians who are either not only in the Elks Club, the majority of the House and Senate in Jim Crow America, the majority of presidents up through Gerald Ford, but then really anybody who's campaigning, if you get onto the lodge circuits, you have this sort of built-in audience where, perhaps you can't openly say you're a segregationist, but if you're announcing your platform in a minstrel show, it's pretty clear
Right.
where your allegiance lies.
You're Ford, not Lincoln.
Exactly.
um, yeah. The but throughout there's also these other, and I was wondering what is the relationship between that civic organization and like the Rotary, the Lions, because all these others, did they
Pick
just
it
kind of
up.
get in on the act afterwards? They kind of like realize the Elks have it going on, and so we're gonna do fundraisers that same way.
Yeah, so the Elks, the minstrels that found the Elks, once they also create the print culture, they develop the print culture in such a way to teach other fraternal lodges and mutual aid societies and organizations to imitate this. And they really aggressively explain why Blackface in particular was high impact revenue. Part of it has to do with the fact that minstrel shows had historically always been coded as a masculine, all male performance space. And so it's a unique genre in which men can physically touch each other, they can sing and dance publicly and still be read as masculine. But at the same time, just as much as there is blackface, there is drag.
I was
And
gonna
so it
say that the
also
drag is the drag was sort of like, oh wow, this is there's a lot going on here.
there's so much. I mean, I could write a whole separate book just about the drag involved in blackface, which also really fortifies the gender racial hierarchy in the
Hmm.
United States. And so basically it comes down to ideas about white masculinity and political power. But to answer your question, yeah, so the Rotary, the Lions, almost all of them are doing it. A lot of politicians and people are in multiple organizations simultaneously, but most of them are racially segregated. A lot of them had clauses that you had to be Christian, so you couldn't be a Jewish member. Almost all of them make you sign an anti-communist pledge. So there's a lot of interesting crossovers between these organizations. The Rotary Club is interesting because the idea of the Rotary was essentially we can only have one dentist and we can only have, one CPA, so that everyone in the organization has to go to that specific professional, and it sort of explodes your business. And so there's a lot of ways in which these groups that are founded in the 1890s through about 1910 that are trying to figure out not just how to create business, but basically create small communities in a rapidly urbanizing United States, and how to reconstitute local networks when you're now increasingly becoming nationalized people who, for business or for whatever reason, might in fact have to go to places like California, or
Sure.
new communities and plug into rapidly a familial system.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's one of the really important features of your book is that you're looking both at that local level and kind of mining it for all of these materials and connections and networks,
Mhm.
but then it's connected through these national, international publishers, and then the American government, which really goes full force into it in the 30s and 30s through the 50s, really. Um,
Mhm.
and that seems to be the moment that there becomes the most resistance, like you said. And I know that you say early on, there was some resistance from the Black community, from others, from having any of these materials kind of unearthed again, which is kind of understandable given the difficulty the NAACP and other organizations had in burying it. And of course, our particular moment is makes it particularly problematic to have any of this stuff exposed again. But um, I'm curious what the response has been now that you've been able to sort of, um, I guess, synthesize this. I mean,
Yeah,
what has been the response to having this conversation back out there and these materials back out there?
it's honestly been amazing. For many years, I will be completely honest, delayed publishing this because I used to be harassed for doing this research, especially before 2020. We were in a very different political moment. And so I was very frightened about what was going to happen. And I have been shocked and honored to discover that we are in a new political context where, although we have a federal administration that is actively attacking history, I think especially after 2020 and the George Floyd protests, there are so many Americans who desperately want to understand how and why we have arrived where we have, how race is culturally constructed, and what it has meant to not just our lives, but our intergenerational history. That I have been shocked that when I give readings at bookstores or when I'm at universities, I oftentimes have people staying for a half hour up to an hour just talking with each other and saying, I was forced to do this as a child. I have these disturbing
Mhm.
memories that not only did I do it as a child, but I won a trophy for doing it. And that I have been so ashamed, but I've never had a place to talk about it with anyone else who was able to talk to me about it. And so I've actually found I I will say I don't like the idea of white guilt because it seems very inward focused, and
Sure.
sort of not productive. So I don't want to say that that's what's happening, but that there's been such an honest dialogue of people trying to reckon with what they did, what their families did, or what happened to them, or perhaps what they witnessed, of all races, and really trying to understand what is the legacy of Jim Crow, which is something that a lot of school systems skip over and
Yeah.
don't really, fully untangle. And so I've been so shocked at the recognition that Americans desperately want to understand our history. I think in academia and in publishing, there is sort of always a joke about like the dad history books. And what I have rapidly discovered is that Americans are just buying the books that they have access to, but they really want to know cutting edge research and they
Mhm.
want to understand their worlds. And so it's really just a matter of trying to show up in places where they where we can find the readers as opposed to hoping that they find us and our work. And so I've just been blown away by the embrace that I've experienced.
Well, it is cutting edge research, and it's really well written. Each chapter just sort of opens with these, I don't know, really kind of poignant vignettes about, connecting some theme to the larger project that you're doing. Um, I know in the conclusion you say, people might want to throw the book out of anger, right? Which would be dangerous because, like I said, it's really big and it could hurt
It
someone.
hurt
Um,
somebody.
yeah, and I definitely felt angry, and I wouldn't say guilt, but some shame and sadness and disgust. But I can only imagine how you felt. I know you said getting it out of your house has felt good, but how has this experience changed you? Um,
You know, I don't think I understood the toll it took on my health. And what I mean by that is not necessarily in like this self-obsessed way. I felt an enormous amount of pressure because there were so many Americans, especially civil rights survivors and also survivors of the Japanese American concentration camps, who entrusted their stories to me. And as those generations have been dying, and as these people whose oral histories that I took were dying, I felt this enormous sense of pressure to not only get their stories out, but to accurately use the platform that I have as a professor to try and get it to the broadest amount of Americans as I could. And I remember really viscerally during the pandemic, before we had the vaccine, I was in New York and New Jersey, and I remember thinking, if I die, these stories die with me. And it
Oof,
was not so much about being scared of dying myself, but that I felt like I held sort of a cultural skeleton key that other Americans needed, and I did not know how to get it to people, and just feeling this disturbing pressure of like I had better get it as right as I can. Um,
right.
and a lot of that was reflected in the narrative choices that I made and how I told the story. It would have been really easy to write a monograph that was just focused on the history of the print culture or the history of the Elks
Yeah.
or the history of the civil rights movement, but I felt that I needed to give that entire arc, um, so that other people could pick up the project and add to it. I mean, you could write an entire book about the covers of these plays. I mean, there's so
Sure.
many other books that can be written, and I hope are. Um, but for me, I don't, like I said, I don't think I had any idea how disturbing this was on a cellular level. There were times that I really wanted to quit, many, many times, in fact. But then I would say to myself, well, Betty Reed Soskin and other sort of heroes in this
Mhm.
book, they didn't have an option to opt out of white supremacy.
Sure.
And so neither do I. The fact that it's uncomfortable or hard for me, like, guess what? That is nothing compared to sitting there as a Black woman watching your entire community perform this, making fun of your child who has just integrated a suburban school. And so taking that responsibility seriously. The other last thing I'll say, just as a woman, realizing how many women in my family were denied an education, um, also made it feel like this was a privilege and an honor to be able to spend time just learning about something and trying to figure it out and writing it down and taking that um, seriously and honoring all of the people in my life who did not get to have an education despite how intelligent they were. So all of those things were sort of always running through my mind whenever I would get pissed off and wanted to give up.
Right, right. Uh, well, now it's out in the world, and people can read it. And we didn't talk about you mentioned it a couple of times, but the stuff you reveal about the Japanese internment camps and the way that it operated there, and the legacy of Commodore Perry doing minstrel shows in Japan in the 1800s. Like, it's all so, uh, the longevity, the depth, the obsession with the minstrelsy
Mhm.
in American culture is truly profound, and I think you've done a great job of capturing it. So thanks so much for your work. I'm glad it's out there, and I hope other people will continue reading it and take you up on the offer of writing whole chapters or whole books on the chapters that you have here. So
Thank
thanks
you.
for thanks for joining us. And so we'll for the next couple of days we're gonna have several other. Tomorrow night we'll have a plenary for the Cultural Studies Association on opposing fascism then and now. That'll be on this channel, but also if you're at the Cultural Studies Association conference, you can see it on Zoom. This episode will be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel, so please share it with your colleagues and let us know if you have any ideas about future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive.com. Thanks for joining us. Again, I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com.